The Flex editor contains a variety of brand new features. Let's tour through the interface and talk about what everything does. So first, let's jump into this Flex section here. And you'll see that we have a variety of options now around the top, left, and right sides. So starting at the top, and possibly the most important aspect of working in Flex, is the Breakpoint Selection bar. The Breakpoint Selection bar exists to show you what your site's going to look like at different sizes. So the first icon, the one with the crown here, is called your desktop, but it's also your main breakpoint. It says changes here can affect all other breakpoints and be overridden per breakpoint. So this is the main breakpoint you're going to want to do the majority of your work on. Each breakpoint below or above that is for doing device or screen size specific edits. So if I click the tablet one, it says changes affect this breakpoint only. So on the tablet size, if I were to change something, it's going to be specific to this breakpoint. Now I guarantee you, you will mess up at some point and do a major edit on a breakpoint that's not your main desktop breakpoint. It happens to us all, and that's just one thing you're going to have to get used to, is clicking back to this main desktop breakpoint anytime you're going to do something substantial. Next up on the left side, we have our layers panel, and the layers panel may be closed by default. So when you enter a Flex section, it may look like this, and we just click layers at the very top, and we're presented with a brand new layers panel. Now, the reason that you need a layers panel in Flex is because there are a variety of containers and boxes in Flex that hold content. And sometimes if you have a lot of content in those, it's very difficult to grab kind of the containing or parent elements. So for example, all of this content here is contained in what's called a Flexbox. And sometimes you may need to add changes to the Flexbox itself. But it's difficult to grab the Flexbox because all of this content is in front of it, or contained within it rather. So on the layers panel on the left side, you can see that at the very top of this kind of stack of content, there's my Flexbox. And when I click on the Flexbox in the layers panel, it's showing me the element that's holding all of this content, and I can make changes to it using the design options on the right side. As I click through various layers and various items within the site, you'll notice that the items on the right side are changing. Think of the right side more as your design panel or design options throughout. So if I select a Flexbox, you'll see that on the right side I have various alignment options. However, if I were to click something else, I don't always have the same options here. This side is going to always change depending on what I've clicked on. Another item to note is this little floating kind of quick selection box. This thing's likely going to become your best friend because it makes it very simple to add elements into a Flex layout. So you can see I just clicked add and it gives me options to put any widget I want in. We also have duplicate or delete options there, and you can drag this around and move it wherever you'd like just by clicking the left side where you get the hand icon and holding it down and dragging. Now let's take a look at the right side options here. The easiest way to think about the options on the right side of the Flex editor is that the items at the top are generally for making more global changes. Or in this case, I have a Flexbox selected. The alignment options here are going to relate to how that Flexbox aligns to the grid behind, or the underlying grid. And as you work your way down through the design options, it's going to almost zoom in on the element you're working on and give you kind of finer control as you go. So at the top, I have an alignment option here for my Flexbox. If I were to click a text block, you'll see we're given slightly different alignment options. So things like left align, we can stretch that text box to the containing element it's within. Below that, we have sizing icons, and you'll see that there's a little question option that you can hover over to give you an idea of what some of these things mean. However, generally you have two options for sizing in Flex. You have percentages and you have pixels. Percentages are going to be fluid. So if I've set this item to be 100% of the width, it's going to be 100% of the width of the containing element. If I set a minimum width to that, that's going to control how small that item is allowed to get as the device scales down. So as I shrink this layout, it's going to keep a minimum size that it's not going to go below. The same goes for a maximum width. Now, many of the options here are grayed out depending on what you've clicked on. However, when you see an A here, if you go up to the question box, it says A is automatically set by the content. So you don't need to edit them if they say A. But what happens, let's say if I have a Flexbox selected here and I look down at our sizing options. There are different options available. One, for example, I have is the minimum height. And again, that's a percentage. That percentage means that this item is going to scale up and down in size relative to the actual browser size. If I click on my grid, you'll see we have very simple sizing options. It just gives me a minimum height for the grid. So each item you click on is going to have a different size available. And just remember to mouse over this little size question mark to give you some idea over what some of these units mean. For example, VW is relative to the viewport width, or rather the width of the screen that the viewer is looking at the site on. Same for VH, that's relative to the viewport height. So if you set something to 100% VH, that means it's going to take up 100% of the vertical height of the screen that the user is looking at. Below the size options, we have animation controls. So this is familiar where you can set a trigger. So when the user scrolls to it, what happens to the item? Does it fade in? That's very simple. We have position. This is also familiar. This allows you to set padding and margin options for your items. So for example, my underlying grid here, I don't want my content touching the left and right edges of it. So you'll see within our position and spacing, we have 100 pixels set as the padding all the way around this section. And below that, we have the various design options for the element that you have selected. So if I choose an image, for example, it's going to give me the design options that you're used to seeing within the editor. And if I were to double click on this image, it allows me to replace the content. So I could select a different image here. I can add a link to it and do some of my SEO work, adding alt text and tooltips, but I don't have a design tab any longer. All of the design options for content are going to be available in this bottom right side. So that's a quick look at the Flex editor layout. In our next video, we're going to discuss some of the specific elements of building Flex layout, such as grids, Flexboxes, and containers.